I was rubbish at interview, just completely rubbish. I went into the interview room. I hadn't really had a lot of interviews. I had an interview to get to university. They were still interviewing in those days. But I came out of both of the interviews thinking, they don't know me. The person they just saw in front of them is not me, but I have completely failed to deliver myself in that interview. And then I did it again, badly. So the lesson I learned from that was I hadn't given myself enough interview preparation. Even after the first bad interview, I didn't go and find someone and say, can you interview me? You know me, can you interview me? And find out whether what you're seeing is what you know. That was a big lesson for me because I hadn't really failed up until that point. I'd sort of done pretty well at school. I'd got through university quite well. And I thought, this is the next obvious path. I'm going to go on the graduate training scheme. It's a great scheme. It's made for me. I'm going to do it. And then I was like, oh no, life doesn't work like that. And if you're not prepared, then you have to really find another way of working around things. And then I wrote my first paper. This is back in 1996. And this is to the Journal of Cerebral Blood Flow and Metabolism, which is a pretty well-respected journal. And submitted this full publication, went to peer review, didn't hear anything. And that was in the days of faxing people or writing letters, no email. And didn't know how long to wait. It's the first paper, I wasn't sure. So I left it quite a few months actually. And then my supervisor said, have you heard about it? I said, no, I haven't. He said, that's ridiculous. That's far too long. Chased again. Editor came back with a rather cryptic message saying, you're having trouble with one of the reviewers. Chased again. A few months later, this was probably about 8, 9, 10 months after I submitted it. And it transpired that one of the reviewers had returned the comments. The other reviewer, it was discovered, was replicating my work in their own lab and was trying to get it published and was withholding the review of my paper. So that was my very first experience of peer review. So life isn't fair, right? Shit happens. And again, I just had to get over that. So it was quite a long delay in getting this paper published. But in some ways I thought, well, it must be good work if they wanted to replicate it and have it as their own. I was then awarded an MRC training fellowship. And for me, that process was actually pretty straightforward. I had what I thought was a good project. I applied for both the MRC and the Welcome. And was awarded the MRC one and pulled out of the Welcome process. And I know that's a huge turning point in careers, and I don't take that lightly. So I was very grateful that for me was a very smooth part of my career. I was on the fellowship. I became pregnant. I actually found out I was pregnant the same day I got the fellowship. There's a whole other story, which is this is not a Women in Science talk, but I worked part-time during that time. And then someone in the department left and there was an application for a lecturer position, which I applied for. And because I was working part-time, I said, I'm only going to do this if I can do this part-time. And I was interviewed alongside 4 other people, all of whom were men working full-time. And I didn't get offered the job. And I thought, okay, that's fair enough. Disappointed though, because I thought, oh, that's a really good job actually, that is one that I like. And I thought I'd perform really well in interview this time. I'd sort of learnt my lesson, I should do well at interview. And then a few hours later, so I got you haven't got the job, and then a few hours later I got a phone call to say, the person we have offered it to has decided not to take it. So I did get the job. So that was really cool. So yeah, you never know, just do your best. I don't think it was, it obviously wasn't a gimme for me to get that job, so I'm very pleased that I did. So that got me onto the lecturing circuit and enabled me to start writing grants. So I had a good idea, I thought, for this grant. I checked the title of it yesterday, Non-Invasive Multimodal Cerebral Monitoring in Neurocritical Care. And there was a scheme called the MRC Career Establishment Scheme. So I thought, I'm establishing my career. This is MRC work. This would fit very well. So I spent, as we all do, blood, sweat and tears writing a grant, which I didn't get. And it was interesting because they were quite focused in this on understanding your career trajectory. So you had to obviously give a full CV and publications. And I'd written very clearly that I was working part-time and I wanted that to be taken into account. So I was working 60%. And when I didn't get the grant, my supervisor said, I think you should just phone up and check that they accounted for your part-time status. So I phoned the MRC, spoke to the program manager and said, oh no, we didn't account for your part-time status. And I said, that's not quite fair, is it? And they said, no, but get over it. That's just life, really. It's too late now. And then the same person said, yeah, I failed at a career in science too. That's why I'm working here. And I thought, oh dear, that's really miserable. That's awful. So there was a lot of chocolate needed on that day. That was a very bad day. And I thought, this is just unfair. And also, I must be terrible. So that was a point where I thought, I think I might just give up on science. But all the people around me said, well, I don't think you should. And one thing that they did do, the MRC, they phoned back and said, well, what you could do is submit your grant as part of the MRC, EPSRC, IRC that was being run in the department as a component grant. So it was another way of using the same grant application, but putting it through another route for funding. And I thought, oh, this is it. Because it was actually, my grant was alpha rated. So they obviously did like the science in it. I spent a huge amount of time rejigging it all and putting it in for this, and I didn't get that one either. And it was only after that that someone said it's very difficult to get resubmissions. Resubmissions are really difficult. If you failed first time, it's quite difficult to get a resubmitted grant passed. So that was not a particular high point, I should say. So 2 failed grant applications. But the one thing that I did remember was, when I calmed down a bit, I reread the reviewer's comments. And one of the things that one of the reviewers has said was, why don't you measure the important rather than making the measurable important? And what they were alluding to was that most of my work up until then had focused on measuring hemoglobin. Okay, so this is just a cartoon of the respiratory electron chain. So I was interested in looking at the optical measurements of hemoglobin and understanding oxygen delivery to the cell. But we knew that there was an enzyme inside the cell, cytochrome, that actually informed on oxygen metabolism. That is really what you want to know. And so I listened to that reviewer. I wrote a completely new grant that was focused on measuring cytochrome. And that grant was funded, and that formed the mainstay of my research for the next 10 to 15 years. So actually, just taking a moment, understanding that in that situation, the reviewer did know what they were talking about, and that I was never going to get that particular work funded unless I switched to something that was really much more applicable, was a really good lesson for me. Meanwhile, I was promoted to senior lecturer, and I increased from 3 to 4 days a week. When I got my senior lecturer position, the dean of the faculty then came into my office and said, well, you'll never make professor part-time. And I thought, well, that's okay, actually, because I prefer being part-time than being a professor, so that's fine with me. And then I attended a women's-only promotion workshop, and they said, you should really apply for promotion. So I did, and I was promoted to professor part-time. That was back in 2008. So don't believe everyone that tells you can't do things, but follow your own instincts. It was important for me that I retain my part-time status. I was then approached by a group that wanted to see whether they could use our technology to look at malaria in India. I'd never done any global health work. And we worked with them and produced a very short paper that's just a proceedings paper. But this really sparked my interest in understanding the use of our technology in remote and resource-poor settings. And so I put my heart and soul into writing another grant to a different panel this time, to the Infections and Immunity Board at MRC, looking at biomarkers for brain function in cerebral malaria. And I had to do a huge amount of research outside of my area, and I really thought we were onto something here. I thought this technology is going to bridge a gap that no other technology can bridge in this particular area. Very excited about it. I had the worst reviewers' comments for that than I'd ever had, including a comment that said, why don't you use MRI? Because we can't get it into the field. And secondly, you'll never get this to work in dark-skinned, dark-haired people. So this is an example where the reviewer was completely wrong, okay? So I just had to swallow that one. Meanwhile, I did at least have my other grants. So I was working at this point on this neurocritical care monitoring, looking at cytochrome, and recognised that we needed to develop systems that helped clinicians interpret the data that we were giving them. And so this led me to produce sorry, it's very small here, or to apply for a Wellcome Trust Health Innovation Challenge Fund, which was really a step towards commercialising a system that enabled data interpretation at the bedside. This was a huge amount of work, not just the application, there were multiple stages of the application and then a quite daunting panel. And we also were rejected from that as well, after a lot of work. And we found out afterwards that there was a genetics project that was high on the agenda, and that was basically going to swallow up all the work. But equally, ours wasn't good enough to convince them. So I thought at the time that was a really critical time in my career, and I thought I really needed that grant. I really needed, that was the next stage on in this neurocritical care that I'd worked in for so many years. And I really felt slightly lost then. I thought, I don't know how I'm going to keep the momentum of this work going. And then I was just emailed by a group from the International Nutrition Group at the MRC that work out of the Gambia. And they'd seen that publication that we published on malaria that led to the failed grant application. And they said, we'd quite like to know whether we can use near-infrared spectroscopy in the Gambia to understand infant brain development. And they introduced me to the Grand Challenge Exploration Scheme, and I applied for this. It was only $100,000. It was a very small amount of money, but I was successful. And I then undertook a sabbatical, and I just listed all of the different meetings and places that I went to, as I threw myself into understanding global health in this perspective in terms of infant brain development. And when I look at this list, I didn't really think about this at the time. There is no way that I could have done this if I had got that Wellcome grant. The Wellcome grant would have swallowed up all of my time. But this was fortuitous because it came along at a time when I could dedicate a lot of energy into understanding the landscape that I was working in and being the newbie in a global health setting and nutrition setting. So that was, in retrospect, a very useful fail from the Wellcome. And now that's led to the grant that I mentioned earlier for brain imaging for global health, which has really, for me, been an incredibly important journey, which I know we use a lot, but not just academically and professionally, but personally, in understanding more about how we can deliver solutions for global health projects. This didn't come without a lot of, or it's continuing to produce a lot of unpredictable things to manage. We got our funding in stages, which meant that the first load of researchers that I employed, we had to let them go, even though we trained them up because the next stage of funding didn't come in quickly enough. Ethics approval on over 2 continents was an interesting process to go through. We had a whole shipment lost in transit to the Gambia, which reappeared in Morocco, but too late, and the replacement kit got damaged on the way out there as well. We completely overestimated the capability of the internet from the field station, which is continuing to prove problematic. And then in the middle of our project, once we'd started recruiting and studying the infants, and this is a longitudinal study, there was a general election and there were issues around that, and a state of emergency was declared and lots of the field staff were flown home. And we had an interruption in our longitudinal study, which is quite difficult when you can't put the babies back in. I kept saying, we've got to keep studying the babies because they're aging. So this was really the 80-20 rule, okay? So I was all over the 80%, but this was the 20% that I didn't know was coming, and we just had to have contingency to deal with issues like this. But having said that, the whole research area now that we call global FNIRS, is the use of near-infrared spectroscopy in global health, is flourishing. And I'm really proud that this really started from the studies that we did in the Gambia, and really started in some respects because I didn't get that Wellcome grant and I could throw lots of energy into instigating this particular field of research. I have managed to get some other grants from EPSRC and also gone back to the Wellcome, swallowed my pride and gone back to the Wellcome. We're setting up systems, wearable systems now, that are being embedded into the World First Toddler Lab, which is opening just across the road in Birkbeck. So persisting with technology development and its application is something that I'm familiar with. So I guess these are the things that I listed at the beginning. Hopefully I've given you an example of how I've come to this particular list. Perseverance is key. It's very trite to say stay positive when things are looking pretty bleak, and academic careers are just very difficult, and if I look back at mine, it's peaks and troughs, but one has to just keep finding something that enables you to keep getting up and going back at it. And for me, it's these 2 things at the bottom actually that have been really important. If I've had a bad day at work, it's really important for me to go home and think about the different part of my life. And also to switch off. So I'm a very keen swimmer. I do lots of swimming. I have a problem with my lower back, so I have to swim anyway. And it gives me time to just switch off and declutter and let new ideas come into my brain, hopefully. I like challenges, so I do a lot of open water swimming, and I managed to swim from Europe to Asia a few years ago. I think I recognise in myself that I don't really sit around and not do things. So actually, this is a switch off for me to do something like this. And last week, I walked part of the Camino Way in Spain and switched off all my email, Twitter, WhatsApp. I said to my family and my kids, who are grown up now, unless it's real emergency, like, you know, Love Island emergency, I don't want to know. So I would thoroughly recommend that you take time out and switch off and give yourself time to recuperate, because it's hard work being an academic. Finally, these are the really important people. All of the people that have supported, there's a lot more people than appear on this slide here, all of the funding agencies. And the most inspirational team that I've worked with in my career is the team on the Bright project, who've really, for me, shown a whole new way of working. I think that's it. Thank you very much.